Oh boy, I'm excited about hearing Barbara McBride Smith and also Antonio Sacri, two of my raves. You know, I particularly like Barbara because she is a retired librarian, and I'm a former librarian, and we all know that librarians rock. She is also an author. That was pretty lame-o. Librarians rock. But she is retired. Of course, throughout being a librarian, she toured nationally, internationally. She produced books. She produced CDs. And also, she has recently moved. She no longer lives in Oklahoma, but she now lives on an island in Texas, off Texas. Not in Texas. Galveston, the Galveston Island off of Texas. I said, could you tell me a little bit about it? And she said, well, sure. It is beautiful, it is historic, and it is very interesting. It has a really interesting city, history. It was quite the place to get away and drink and see some gals and so forth in the old days. And I thought, wow, you must be doing a lot of research for your set at 2:30 tomorrow in the Creekside tent called Not Your Mama's Bible. She said, I've gotten a few stories from there. But as I thought about beautiful, historic, and interesting, I thought about Barbara McBride Smith. She has a long history with this festival, and she's a good friend to this festival. We all feel like we know her. She does stories out of history. She takes old myths and twists them into the most hysterical stories you have ever heard. She is interesting. All you have to do is ask her about her life. And of course, she is beautiful. Her heart, her words, and her soul. Please welcome the beautifully interesting, historic Barbara McBride Smith.
Historic. Yeah, I know another name for that. When I was in 6th grade, my teacher, Mrs. Burt, sent home a note with every kid in our class. This note said that a week from Friday, we were going to have something called Dad's Day. And she was inviting all of our daddies who could to come to our classroom that day and talk about their professions. I said, Miss Burt, my daddy doesn't have a profession. He has a job. And she said, that'd be fine. Well, I knew that this was going to be an occasion of pride for a lot of the kids in my 6th grade class. I knew that Betty Gale McCall's daddy would most likely come. He was a professor of law at Baylor University, which was just down the street from our school. Dr. McCall knew a lot about criminals and executions, which were very popular topics in Texas in those days and still is. So I knew all the 6th graders would be interested in listening to Dr. McCall talk about his profession. We were all hoping that Mary Beth Dunwoody's daddy would come because he was a sales representative for the Mars Candy Company. We were hoping he'd bring free samples for all of us. And then there was Linda Ledbetter's daddy. He was a preacher. We didn't care much if he came or not. And there was Carlene Privet's daddy. He was a tattoo artist. Bubba Bodenhammer's daddy was the assistant manager at the skating rink. And Calvin Conley's daddy was an undertaker. And it don't get any better than that. But my daddy, he was a janitor at Baylor University School of Law, where Betty Gale McCall's daddy was a professor. I didn't think that there was a 6th grader on the face of the earth who would want to hear about floor waxing and trash removal. So I didn't want to take that note home. But I knew I'd get in trouble if I didn't, so when school was out, I stuck that note down into my notebook and I carried it home with me, but I deliberately let it flop out of the notebook, just kind of flapping in the wind as I walked home. And I was hoping it would just fly right out of that notebook and end up in the gutter and I'd never get home with it. But that didn't happen. As I was walking along, one of the first graders who lived around the corner from me, her name was Delia Moore, she was always trying to walk home with me. I was always trying to keep her from it. She ran, she caught up with me. She said, "Hey, Babs, McBride, you got something hanging out of your notebook. You gonna lose it, you gonna watch out." And I said, "Well, I don't care if I do lose it, because it's bad news." She said, "Ooh, you did something naughty in school. You're going to get a whooping when you get home. You know what, when I get notes like that, I just eat them. I just put in my mouth, I chew them up. My mama never said, 'You want me to eat that note for you?'" I said, "No, thanks, Dee. My mama would find out about it. I better not." She said, "Well, thanks for waiting for me, Babs." I said, "I didn't wait for you. Why don't you just go on home? I'm taking my time." And I did. Well, I got home with that note, and I didn't show it to my daddy. I didn't show it to my mama either. I just left it in the back of my notebook for several days. I was hoping maybe it would just disappear off the face of the earth, but it didn't. Well, my mama found the note, because my mama, when I was 12 years old, couldn't mind her own business. And so she went in my room and she was checking to see if I'd done my homework, and she came across that note. Well, she pulled it out. She came walking into the other room where I was, and she held it up and she said, "Don't you think you ought to give this to your daddy?" And I said, "No. My daddy's job is not educational. My daddy is not interesting. Nobody wants to listen to him." And my mama said, "I have been trying not to listen to your daddy for the last 25 years. And I can't help myself. If there's one thing you can say for your daddy, it is that he is interesting. Don't you think you ought to give him a chance?" So I knew I was going to have to give that note to my daddy. It was a hard decision for me, because, you see, back when I was 6, 7 years old, my daddy had been my hero. I was so proud of him when I was 6 instead of 12 going on 16. My daddy was my hero in those days. I thought he looked handsome in his bright green Baylor University janitorial uniform with the gold Baylor bear embroidered right here and his name underneath it, George Coy McBride. But now I thought he looked like the Jolly Green Giant. But back when I was 6 years old, sometimes Daddy would take me to work with him on holidays or weekends when I was out of school and he was working overtime. He taught me how to change the toilet paper rolls in all the bathrooms at the law school. He taught me how to change the paper towels. He gave me my own key to the paper goods closet at the law school. When it came time to gather up all the trash in the building, my daddy and I would play Lone Ranger and Tonto. I always wanted to be Tonto, so he had to be Lone Ranger. We'd get out my daddy's rolling trash carts, 2 of them, and they would be our horses, Silver and Scout. And we'd get on to those rolling trash carts, and down the hall we'd go looking for bad guys. My daddy would stop at a classroom or an office, and he'd point inside, and he'd say, "And there's a bad guy. Go get him, Kimosabe." And I'd jump off of my horse, and I'd run in there, and I'd get the bad guy, the trash can. I'd bring it out and hand it to my daddy, and he'd say, "We're going to clean up this territory." And he'd dump that trash can, and he'd bang it on the bottom and dump the guts of the bad guy into the rolling trash cart. Well, we'd just keep on going down the hall, gathering up all the trash we could, and finally, when we got our trash carts full, Daddy would say, all right, now we're going to go out and get rid of these bad guys. And so we'd head out the back door toward that big dumpster out behind the law school, and Daddy'd say, where are we going, Kemo-sabe? And together, we'd go out that back door singing, to the dump, to the dump, to the dump, 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 to the dump, to the dump, to the dump, dump, dump. I loved going to work with my daddy. It was more fun than going to the Melrose movie theater. But when I got to be 12 years old and in 6th grade, I had learned to be embarrassed about my daddy's job. So I took that note to him. I handed it to him. He read it. He looked at me and he said, you don't really want me to come to your classroom, do you? No, I said. You're afraid I'll embarrass you in front of your friends, aren't you? Yep, I said. He said, you know, I am a dadgum good janitor. I don't believe they could run that Baylor Law School without me. Why, you take Dr. McCall's office. If I didn't go in there and clean that thing up every day, it'd be a rat's nest by the end of the week. Abraham Lincoln said one time, whatever you are, be a good one. And I'm a good janitor, baby. But I can see why you're embarrassed. So I tell you what I'm going to do. I am not going to come up there and talk about my job at the Baylor Law School, the things I do there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come up and talk about my secret profession. I had no idea what my daddy was talking about. He said, don't worry about a thing, Kemo-sabe. It's all going to be good. Well, all I could do was wait in dread for Dad's Day in the 6th grade. Well, meanwhile, my daddy made arrangements with my teacher, Mrs. Burt, to be the last dad on the program that morning. He told her he'd be there by about 10:45. Meanwhile, he made arrangements with his boss at Baylor University to eat his lunch early that day so that he could come to my school. Well, that Friday came, and then it was 10:45 in the morning. We'd already had several dads who had talked to us, and I was hoping Daddy wasn't going to make it. But then I heard him. I heard his voice, that unmistakable baritone voice out in the hallway. And as he came walking into my classroom, I heard him say, Come with me now, boys and girls, to the thrilling days of yesteryear. A fiery horse, a cloud of dust, and a hearty, hi-yo, silver. And my dad walked into my classroom. He was wearing his bright green Baylor University janitorial trousers. But on top, he was wearing a white double-breasted shirt. He had a red neckerchief on. He had a white Stetson and a black mask around his eyes. I just dropped my face straight down onto my desk, and I just prayed that the Lord would make me disappear off the face of the earth. It didn't happen. Bubba Bodenhammer, who sat right across the aisle from me, reached over and with his finger, he poked me real hard in the arm and he said, Babs McBride, I didn't know your daddy was a Lone Ranger. I rolled my face over to look at him and I said, you think you're surprised? I couldn't look at him. But I heard my dad walking toward the front of the room. Kids were talking as he walked up there. They were saying, oh, hey, that's Clayton Moore. He's the guy who plays Lone Ranger on television. You know, he used to be a real Texas Ranger. No, I think it's the guy who plays the Lone Ranger on the radio. My dad got up to the front of the room and he quietened everybody down. He said, thank you, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. No, I just want to clear things up here. I'm not Clayton Moore. He's just a TV actor, and I'm not Brace Beamer. He's just a radio actor. I am the true Lone Ranger, the man behind the mask, whose identity will never be revealed. Little Lupe Gonzalez sat up on the front row. She didn't say much, but she reached up, she grabbed my daddy's hand, and she said, "Don't worry, Mr. McBride, we won't tell nobody." That was when I started looking up at my dad. Well, he spent about the next 15 or 20 minutes talking about truth and justice. It got started because Calvin Conley, the undertaker's kid, raised his hand and said, hey, Mr. Lone Ranger, how many bad guys have you killed? And my daddy said, "You know, son, I'm the champion of truth and justice, but I never shoot to kill. You see, life is precious, just like my silver bullets. I don't want to waste either one of them." Oh, speaking of silver bullets, how would you boys and girls like to have a silver bullet of your own? My dad reached down into the pockets of his uniform pants, and he pulled out his hands, opened them up, and they were full of silver bullets. Well, sort of. You see, I knew what my daddy's real secret profession was. He was a junk collector. We had a garage full of junk. And behind the garage, there was a shed that he had filled all the way to the top with scrap metal. Somehow my dad had taken some of that scrap metal, and he had twisted it and turned it and melted it and made it into 32 silver bullets. Well, as soon as the sixth graders got their hands on those silver bullets, they didn't think any more about Snickers and Milky Ways and Three Musketeers. Everybody was oohing and ahhing over their silver bullets while my daddy talked about truth and justice. He didn't sound like a man with a sixth grade education. He sounded like a man who worked at Baylor University as a teacher. Well, after he talked about that for a while, then he started talking about the adventures that he and Tonto had out on the range cleaning up the bad guys. And then he said, "You know, a lot of people know jokes about Lone Ranger and Tonto, don't they?" He said, "I got a lot of jokes about Lone Ranger and Tonto. Y'all want to hear one?" I thought, oh, no, Lord, don't let him get started. See, my daddy probably had 1,000 jokes about Lone Ranger in his head. But, of course, every sixth grader wanted to hear a joke, so they all raised their hand, and he said, "All right, I'll just tell you my favorite one." So one time, me and Tonto, we was out there on the range, and we'd been working hard all week, getting rid of them bad guys, running them off, and, well, we got real tired, and it was starting to get dark, so we just set up our tent out there, and we crawled in there, and we went to sleep. Well, sometime in the middle of the night, Tonto wakes me up, and he says, "Kimosabi, look up. What do you see?" And I looked up and I said, "Oh, Tonto, I see stars. Millions of stars." And Tonto says to me, "Well, what does that tell you?" And I said, "Well, astronomically, it tells me that there could be millions of planets and even millions of galaxies. Astrologically, it tells me that Leo is in Saturn. Theologically, it tells me that there is a creator greater than all of us. Time-wise, it tells me it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. Weather-wise, it tells me we're going to have a real nice day. What does it tell you, Tonto?" And Tonto says to me, "Tells me somebody stole our tent, paleface." Well, the kid in my class who laughed the loudest was Elijah Big Pond. Elijah had told us that he was half Comanche, half Apache. His dad was a policeman, and he hadn't been able to get off work that day to come to our class. So Elijah raised his hand and he said, "Mr. Lone Ranger, my daddy loves Tonto and Lone Ranger jokes too. Could I tell one of them?" And my dad looked back at Mrs. Burt for her approval. She nodded. So my dad said, "Sure, son, come on up." And so Elijah went up and stood right next to my dad, real close, I guess for courage, and he told his dad's favorite Lone Ranger and Tonto joke. And then after that, Mario Lopez raised his hand. He said, "My dad's bus driver. He can't be here today. Can I come up and tell you a joke my dad likes?" My dad said, "Sure, son, come on up." And Mario told a joke his dad loved. And one by one, every kid in our class whose dad couldn't be there that day, or kids who didn't have a dad at home, would come up and tell a story about their dad or their grandpa. Even little Lupe Gonzalez, whose daddy was still in Mexico and was hoping to get to the United States by Christmas, she told us about her dad. Well, it got to be close to noon. And Mrs. Burt said, "Boys and girls, it's getting to be time for lunch. We're going to have to let the Lone Ranger get back to his profession, and we're going to have to go eat." And all the kids in my class started going, "No, no, no. Can we have the Lone Ranger have lunch with us? Can he stay for lunch?" And my daddy said, "Well, thank you, boys and girls. I'd like to do that, but there's trouble brewing out there in the Badlands. I got to get out there and clean things up." And so my dad said goodbye to everybody, shook every kid's hand. And then he walked toward the door of our classroom. But when he got to my desk, he stopped. And he squatted down. And he said, "Little lady, I want to thank you for inviting me here today. It has been a real honor." And he took off that white Stetson and he put it on my head. And he walked out of the classroom singing, "To the dump, to the dump, to the dump, 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 to the dump, to the dump, to the dump, dump, dump." Ms. Burt got us all lined up for lunch. As we were going down the hall toward the lunchroom, Betty Gail McCall caught up with me in line. She said, "Oh, Babs McBride, you got the most interesting daddy of anybody in our classroom." And I said, "I know that." And I did know it. And I never forgot it again. My daddy was a dadgum good janitor. My daddy was a dadgum good dad. Sure, he waxed floors, he removed trash, he cleaned toilets. But in the thrilling days of yesteryear, my daddy taught me, never judge a man by the clothes that he wears. Rest in peace, Kemo Sabe.